I call Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to offer my congratulations to Melissa Lee as the new chair of the Commerce Select Committee, and let's hope that the standards on the Commerce Select Committee remain high. I think Clayton Cosgrove's contribution in the House today has set the standard for discussion on bills that go before that committee, that august committee, where there is much intelligent conversation. August. And I do hope that that continues. Mr Speaker, I just want to quickly give the House a little bit of a history lesson around this bill, because it appears the way it's been couched today by the government is that it somehow miraculously came out of a review that happened in 2012 initiated by the government. Well, that isn't the case. This actually is legislation that stems back to the previous Labor government, a review that was undertaken then by the then Commerce Minister, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, who was, if I recall, having sat on the Commerce Select Committee with her for the first 3 years in opposition, was extremely passionate about standards and about the importance of standards and about the lack of action that was happening by this government around the modernisation of standards and the governance of standards. Thankfully, we're now at a point, having gone through a review, and that review, just by the way, actually attracted, in 2012, 115 submissions. Quite intense submissions, haven't had a chance to go through them all, and if that's any indication of the importance that this issue is given by the community, then I think that what we're going to see in the Select Committee is a replication of that, and I would like to echo my colleague Clayton Cosgrove's view that pushing this bill through without the proper scrutiny would be a big mistake. The standards underpinning any industry activity in our country need to be standards that are robust. Therefore, the body that creates those standards and maintains and keeps a watchful eye on them needs to be a body that has the respect and trust and integrity and also the resources required to ensure that it actually does the job. And that brings me to my questions, Mr Speaker. It appears pretty much that the option that's being pushed by the government to move the standards body function within MB is actually driven by cost cutting and driven by a desire to actually reduce the costs of running a standards body. Now, if that's the case, then I've got a problem with that, and we're supporting that to this bill to Select Committee, but that will be one of the issues that we'll be keeping a very close eye on and listening to what the industry says, because of those 115 submissions on that review, the vast majority of them were very concerned about moving the standards function within MB and creating a standards officer, or whatever the term is being used, a standards statutory officer role within MB. My question is that adequate? Is that actually going to do the job, and is there going to be the strength and the weight behind that function within the ministry to actually maintain that job? Now, see, these are some of the things that the submitters said. They didn't think that pushing the function within MB would achieve the necessary independence. They said independence couldn't be achieved under this model, that there was possibility for capture by well-resourced and influential stakeholders. The Standards Board could not be fully impartial when both assessing standards and approving SDOs to develop standards, and that statutory independence is not possible if members of the Standards Board are appointed by the government. I think that there has been some taking account of those views in the response by the Ministry and in the legislation that we see before us, but I'm not sure that that's enough. The second point, and the second point is linked to that, it's around cost. Even the regulatory impact statement itself says in its first page that the advice we have received suggested that overall costs of standards development can be reduced by moving the function into a larger organisation. Now, what that means is that, or what that suggests, and what I fear, is that that's the main reason for doing it, that it's actually not being driven just by common sense or wanting to improve the service, but it's actually being driven by the desire to cut costs. And if that's the case, if we're talking about environmental standards, if we're talking about building standards, these things are pretty important because they underpin the way that we operate, and they underpin the trust that we have in our industries and the way that they're carried out. The third point that I'd like to make, the third issue, is in regard to the amendment of the Copyright Act, which is proposed as, which is a pretty significant part. It isn't covered very greatly in the legislation that's before us, or by the words by the Minister today. But it's had its own. It's obviously of enough significance to have its own regulatory impact statement produced by MB, which I have to say does give me some concern, because the proposed new organisation is going, and home is going to be within MB. So I'll put that on the record as a concern in the first place. It would seem to me that the RIS could have been produced independently in order, through Treasury or something, in order to actually provide some true independence of this. Now, the issue that was raised around this, and what is proposed, is that the bill is amending section 27 of the Copyright Act 1994 to maintain existing copyright protections for standards. This amendment is important to protect intellectual property owned by third parties, including international parties, and to remove uncertainty in the application of copyright or Crown copyright in New Zealand standards that result from moving the standards development function into the Ministry. Now, that all sounds on the surface perfectly reasonable, and the concerns that were raised by the Standards Council around this potential move, they said that copyright in standards was a key issue. Discussions have focused on international intellectual property and royalty arrangements and the need to honour obligations and enforcement in copyright. It does appear as if MB has gone to some lengths to try and work out what those issues are and how they can be addressed, and to propose an option which provides copyright protection similar to the current standards, and legislative certainty to eliminate risk of standards becoming freely available. My concern, though, and this is my concern, and this is what I'll be raising in the committee, and hoping and pretty sure that there will be submitters on this, Mr. Speaker, is that isn't it time that we looked at this a bit differently? Isn't it time that we stop looking at this from within a prism of just solely protection, and looking at the availability and opening up of copyright and open standards? It was Labor's policy going into the election to take standards seriously, take a modern approach to this, with the aim of moving towards genuine openness and transparency in government, which this government says it is, but in practice, I've got grave concerns isn't. That we're thoroughly documented open standards are made publicly available at no cost. Now this is not new. It follows the UK government's definition of open standards. I think it's something that we need to have the conversation about in Select Committee. If we are to be a truly modern government, if we are doing a lot of stuff electronically online, there is questions about how open these standards should be, and go back to some of the first principles discussion around the copyright protection. So I think that's some significant issues that we need to put on the table for the Select Committee. Some of these issues were raised around copyright in the submissions to the review that have led to this legislation. I just hope the Minister and the officials are listening. Thank you.